Welcome back in another episode of the Sovereign Renaissance, a channel where we discuss the mystical, arcane, and all things multidimensional. Now, in this episode, we're going to be discussing, or rather, having a closer look at the succubus entity and how that affects the female psyche. In an energetic quarantine of the mind, when a parasitic entity embeds itself within the female subconscious, it doesn't just feed on emotion, it actively rewires the cognitive architecture by usurping the inner animus and turning the woman's protective mental faculties against her. The entity forces a literal psychic split. What follows is a quiet, devastating freeze on higher order reasoning, independent authority, and intellectual sovereignty. In esoteric frameworks, occult traditions, and psychological analysis of spiritual phenomena, the concept of a succubus or parasitic entity operating within a female's psyche is often understood as a metaphor for deep seated psychological blocks. While traditional law typically views the succubus as a malevolent spirit targeting men, modern esoteric psychology and shadow work often recontextualize these entities when examining their impact on women. Rather than a literal external demon, this energy is frequently interpreted as a parasitic archetype or a manifestation of internalized trauma. Here is how this dynamic is understood to stagnate cognitive and psychological development in females. Fragmentation of the ego and dissociation. When a parasitic or succubus like energy is active within the female psyche, it often thrives on trauma, particularly related to early childhood or maternal wounds. The mechanism: to cope with intense emotional pain, the mind splits or dissociates. The cognitive stagnation: instead of developing a cohesive, mature ego, the individual remains fragmented. Cognitive energy that should be used for critical thinking, emotional regulation, and self actualization is instead entirely consumed by maintaining psychological defense mechanisms and processing looping intrusive thoughts. Trapping the mind in looping or regression. In metaphysical studies, these entities are said to feed on dense, low vibrational emotion states like shame, guilt, and unexpressed anger. The mechanism: the entity acts as an internal abuser or critic, constantly reminding the individual of past failures, perceived inadequacies, or inherent unworthiness. Cognitive stagnation. This keeps the cognitive faculties stuck in a state of developmental regression. The individual becomes trapped in a childlike or hypervigilant survival state. The sympathetic nervous system's fight or flight response. Higher order cognitive processing, such as long term planning, abstract reasoning, and objective decision making, is severely impaired when the brain is stuck in chronic survival mode. Distortion of the animus or the internal masculine. In Jungian psychology, the animus represents the unconscious masculine archetype within a woman. which governs the logic, structure, boundaries, assertion, and external action. The mechanism. A parasitic entity can corrupt or usurp the healthy development of the animus. Instead of acting as an internal source of strength and protective boundaries, the internal masculine energy becomes tyrannical, manipulative, or entirely passive aggressive. The cognitive stagnation. Without a healthy, integrated animus, a female may struggle to develop sovereign authority over her own mind. This can manifest as an inability to set firm boundaries, susceptibility, susceptibility to external manipulation, such as coercive control or high control group dynamics, and a reliance on codependent loops that prevents independent cognitive growth. Somatic draining and vital force depletion. Both occult traditions and the psychosomatic medicine note that a prolonged mental obsession or spiritual parasitation has a direct physical toll. The mechanism. The constant energetic or psychological drain disrupts sleep patterns, hormonal imbalance, and overall vitality. The cognitive stagnation. Neurogenesis, also known as the growth of new brain cells, and neuroplasticity require physical energy, deep rest, and a sense of safety. When the body's vital force is chronically depleted by internal warfare, cognitive processing speed, memory retention, and intellectual focus naturally decline. The path to integration. In shadow work and metaphysical clearing, overcoming this type of stagnation rarely involves fighting the entity. Instead, it requires identifying the core trauma or vulnerability that allowed the parasitic pattern to take root, withdrawing one's attention and emotional energy from the loop, and consciously building robust psychological boundaries. And so, the true violence of the succubus is not the theft of vital breath, but the freezing of internal sulfur. By mirroring a woman's unexamined shadow back to her as an intoxicating, static perfection, the entity ensures the inner child never undergoes the friction of psychological death and rebirth. She is left beautifully preserved, yet utterly inert. A locked garden where the fruit is forbidden to rot and therefore forbidden to ever sprout a new seed. And if you liked this episode, please do like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, goodbye.